I'm going to talk a little bit more at a granular level around how the kind of problem that Mark pointed to of how we actually do this thing called One Health. And because Mark's group is largely focused on AMR, I've chosen AMR as a case study, and under sort of looked at dimension of that is agriculture. So for those of you who don't know, AMR is obviously a consequence of the evolution of bacteria developing resistance to antibiotics and exposure, and that exposure happens in a classic One Health sense within human healthcare, within agriculture, and then also across the environment. So it's sort of been held up as one of the classic exemplars of a One Health problem. And today I'm going to talk about it really in terms of how power is used in the Australian context. So this is government power to try and shape the use of antibiotics in beef and dairy farming in Australia based on some research we've been done over the last year or so. And I'm looking at 3 sites where this power is exercised, and these are the places of action or where we're going to actually have the inquiry. And this is looking at new policy development, looking at new policy implementation. And then obviously with all policies, you don't start with a clean slate. So also looking at the residue of previous policies, which in the case of antibiotics and agriculture is actually talking about them or actually having them embedded in our society and our systems such that they actually act as an infrastructure. So this is a fantastic insight from Claire Chandler from the London School of Tropical Health and Medicine. I can't, those words may not be in the correct order, but or they're all in the title. And it's this way of thinking about antibiotics that they do lots of things that we would assume would have roles of other things like care or people or other sorts of tasks. So the same way that a road is a piece of infrastructure or a pipe that brings water to your house is a piece of infrastructure, they kind of recede into the background. So you don't actually notice that they're there until you take them away. So antibiotics do this type of work for us in a number of different settings. And one of the most prominent is, I don't know why that's not advancing, is in agriculture. So following on from the Second World War, population explosion across the world, there was a great concern in global policy circles and global government circles about feeding the rest of the world over the next century. So there was this thing called the Green Revolution, where agriculture became a science and industrialized to the extent that we were aiming to gain higher productivity and yield from existing resources. And antibiotics were a key component of meeting this particular demand. Within this, then, antibiotics became something which was used as a management tool and a way of constructing processes and systems such that you generated more product. So you got more milk, you got more beef, you got more wool, all of those different types of things took place as a means of actually increasing agricultural productivity. If we look at other systems and ways of doing things, I really don't know why that doesn't want to advance, but I'll just play with my mouse. You can see there are other examples or exemplars of where this happens. So antibiotics are used classically to substitute for higher levels of care in places in low-income countries where they don't have access to doctors or hospitals or sophisticated medical interventions. So rather than doing something complicated, you just give antibiotics to assuage the problem. And we also use antibiotics as a substitute for political infrastructure in areas where hygiene may not necessarily be the highest. Even in high income countries, we also still use antibiotics as infrastructure within other settings, which are quite familiar. So antibiotics as a substitute for nursing care in aged care in Australia, because the amount of resources and people needed to manage things like cystitis and other types of chronic conditions means that giving a course of antibiotics is often a quick workforce effective solution to dealing with these types of issues. So what are we going to talk about in general is in the Australian context? Well, because AMR crosses across all these sectors and there are inevitably going to be tragic choices in terms of who we do not allow to have antibiotics and the types of burdens that this places on systems, it's easier to think of it as a bit of a super wicked problem. If we look globally, actually Australia does quite well in terms of our management of agriculture-related AMR. And this is really a consequence of early steps and early measures taken largely within a One Health framework to avoid these types of scenes, which is how most people think about industrialized agriculture in other parts of the world. And we're reaping the benefits in some ways of an earlier precautionary approach, which was drawing on what's called the Swan Report from the 1970s, which came out, which pointed to agriculture as a means or a drive of antibiotic resistance, which led to the withdrawal from Australian veterinary use of a number of different antibiotic compounds, which continued to be used elsewhere in the world. And then we had a sometimes fraught but highly productive thing called the Jeticar process, where if you actually talk to people who are on this committee, they talk of it as being life-changing and destroying and making forged friendships across generations because of the amount of heat that was in it in terms of the cross-sectoral politics between the medical profession and veterinary profession in coming to a resolution on what to do. But the actual findings that they came to have actually been quite useful because it removed some of the newer antimicrobials that were coming through, such as third-generation cephalosporins, fluoroquinolones and other drugs which were used extensively in agriculture throughout the Americas and Europe, but weren't used in Australia, with the consequent decline and baseline levels of resistance have therefore been much lower in Australia than elsewhere. So what did we do for our study to actually see how antibiotics are used in the context between they're done? So we did a policy analysis looking at a range of different policy bodies and governing bodies which have some say or are implicated in antibiotic use in veterinary medicine and agriculture. And we did basically looking at the policies around the stages of use, and nothing too exciting there, just to really show what we did. And then we also did about 20 or so interviews with beef and dairy farmers in New South Wales, industry representatives of these industries, and then the veterinarians would work with them. And we asked them basically what they use antibiotics for and the measures that they have taken to improve stewardship over the last 10 years, their attitudes and experiences of the current controls and systems of use of antibiotic around antibiotic use in agriculture. And then the issues associated with implementing further antibiotic restrictions. So really getting an idea what they thought would be bearable or unbearable if further restrictions on the use of antibiotics were brought forward quite soon. So this document was mentioned earlier by Mark as the National Policy for AMR, which is really oriented around a One Health approach, which is what Maxine has been basically laying out in the previous 20 minutes. But compared to other jurisdictions in the world, the way in which One Health is being operationalized in Australia is very much on a consensus-driven and a consultative basis. So at the national policy level, they're not too big on making hard rules about how you use antibiotics. They're much more around trying to get people into the same room, consult, and come to sort of positions and descriptions of what should happen next. The key things that they're focused on in terms of restricting antibiotic use are things like educational programs for physicians, clinicians, having voluntary systems of audit and feedback so that people know how much antibiotics they're prescribing relative to others, and then having consumer awareness campaigns and advertising using social media and other forums to basically try and educate the public, educate practitioners, and try and convince them to use antibiotics differently. This has also happened in the veterinary sphere, but within the veterinary sphere, there's also a couple of other types of pillars or policy landscapes that are operating. So for vet prescribers, they were given sole authority to prescribe antibiotics early in the 20th century, which obviously was a point of professional building up the authority of the profession in this space, actually giving them quite a bit of power. There are also a number of peak bodies which contribute to the AMR collaboration around our national strategies, including the Australian Veterinary Association and a number of other animal health related government institutions. Practitioners are subjected to antimicrobial stewardship education. I don't know why I put the word subjected there, but it sounds quite bossy, but I think that's what they do. They have restricted access to 3 antibiotics classes, which are now deemed to be quite important to human health going into the future. But as a professional courtesy, they're allowed to prescribe off-label in certain circumstances. And generally, they're just a slap on the wrist if antibiotics are used inappropriately over a long period of time. So if you look at the key sort of transactions in AMR in agriculture, you have a veterinarian who's operating under this sort of policy world. And then you have the agriculture producer who has a whole set of other rules which are operating in their sphere. And so these basically, the only way that they can access antibiotics is through the veterinary prescription, which is unusual compared to some other jurisdictions that they're competing against in terms of markets. The peak bodies for these industries aren't directly involved in setting antibiotic policies or AMR national strategies. They can make submissions, but they're not actually in the room where these decisions are made. Again, they have these educational programs and ways in which they're basically put in the spot to try and develop new husbandry techniques, promote hygiene, biosecurity, and to reduce demand from antimicrobials. So this way of basically reducing the need for antibiotics through enhancing the environment of the animal so that they're less needed. But the key difference is that their actual products are tested in a way for antibiotic residues. So this is a food safety regulation which is put in place to protect people of antibiotic allergies. And it's one of the main drivers of all of their behaviours around antibiotics, as I'll explain further down the track. And rather than just having slaps on the wrist, there are actually severe sanctions and monetary rewards for compliance against these residues and food safety regulations. So if we look at there are a couple of theories I want to draw on here, which pertain to One Health and then also pertain to the implementation of One Health. So Nancy Roberts, who is a decision scientist, put forward this idea of how power is used in policy development around super wicked problems. And if you look at the diagram here, you can see that there are various ways in which the way the power is distributed against the stakeholders within any one sort of context, and in the context we're talking about One Health, determines the types of strategies that can be used to develop policy which can be taken forward. So you can have competitive strategies if power is contested and dispersed equally across stakeholders. You can have collaborative strategies where power is basically where there's nobody, where power is a little bit more narrowly confined in terms of the stakeholders there. So rather than having something which requires people to compete for the right solution, you can have something which requires people to negotiate the right solution. And then if power is not dispersed, so if power is quite centralized, then you can have authoritative strategies of a way in which you can basically make things happen and develop them. So this is usually cited by bioethicists as a model approach for dealing with the loss of established rights in key sectors relevant to AMR. So if we think about how veterinarians and farmers, who are both on either side of those transactions around the use of antibiotics and AMR, fit into these systems, we can see that there's some authoritative dimensions, some collaborative dimensions, and some competitive dimensions. And it fits quite nicely within the One Health frame. If we also then look at, obviously, implementation, then there's some really neat work from the sociologist, from organizational theorist Amitai Etzioni, which looks at how power is actually used in terms of implementation. Because when you develop a policy, it doesn't necessarily magically translate into effective implementation. So it's how organizations wield power over lower level members. So if we think as the veterinary profession as being an organization and dairy industries and beef industries as being organizations, there are various ways in which the types of power are exercised can induce compliant or non-compliant behavior. So simply you can have a big stick or be coercive, which can lead to alienative involvement, which basically means that people comply but they hate you and they're more likely to rebel or try to find ways to get around what you're doing. There's more of a utilitarian type of power, which is, again, sort of in this sense, requires a calculative involvement. So that means if you have a utilitarian model of exercising power, you basically reward people or you incentivize them for doing the right thing. So you pay them for doing the right thing. Or then you can have the normative way that power is exercised, which basically makes a moral case. So if you want to be a good veterinarian or you want to be a good farmer, these are the types of behaviours you should adopt. The key insight is that if you don't have the type of involvement of the lower level member of the organisation, which in this case would be veterinarians or farmers, matching the type of power that you're exercising in the policy approach that you're using, then you get non-congruence, which means that it doesn't necessarily work very well and can create non-compliance or a degree of political difficulty for the way it's being implemented. And the other thing is that you can't necessarily sustainably achieve normative ends through coercive means. So people are not going to necessarily buy normative arguments if their way in which they're thinking about these issues and the way in which the problem has been structured for them in the past is in a calculative frame. So how does this actually play out for how veterinarians and farmers use antibiotics? So veterinarians are on the supply side. So they've had some authoritative, coercive power applied to restricting their level of use of antibiotics in a very limited sense. But most of it is all done through a very collaborative and negotiative way, which reflects the sort of status of the profession and the way in which the Australian government and regulators treat professional bodies is they don't like making a lot of rules for them. They like to let them self-govern in essence. And therefore, they've had these programs where it's all about awareness raising and education and trying to enroll members into the profession to meet AMS objectives to reduce antibiotic use. Now, the focus of the governing system around antibiotic use in the veterinary profession is antimicrobial resistance. And the goal is to reduce the supply while protecting animal welfare. So there's kind of this mantra, which is often used within veterinary circles, which is as little as possible and as much as necessary. And the compliance is maintained amongst practitioners or the lower levels of the organisation through normative power and moral involvement. So they want to make people feel good about not using antibiotics when it's not necessary. And they want to make them feel bad about themselves if they just start giving antibiotics without due consideration to the risks of antimicrobial resistance into the future. So the responsibilities are oriented around maximising health and animal health, both human and animal. These types of compliant mechanisms are quite good in the sense that they're quite cheap. They don't have a compliance structure, so you don't need to have people going around policing them. But the flip side of that is that they actually don't necessarily always work, and you can still have vets that are prescribing antibiotics inappropriately. For farmers, these same systems on the other side of the corn, which mainly fit around the food safety regulations that I pointed to, have a completely different focus. So they're actually focused on antibiotic residues, not AMR. So the whole way that farmers are trained through the structures and systems and the policies which govern how they use antibiotics to think about them is about the potential for them to cause residues and their value, calculative and economically, as a management tool to deal with welfare issues and injury in their herds. So the goal that they're operating on is to reduce antibiotic use as a food safety system, makes their residues a significant and catastrophic business risk. So it's all about how their business operates. Compliance is maintained through calculative involvement and utilitarian power, and their responsibilities are oriented around food safety, animal health, welfare, and productivity. So this compliant mechanism is very different because it has an enforcement system. So actually they have to pay the industries that they work for. There's a levy on everything that they sell, which pays for them to be policed about making sure that everybody does the right thing. The benefits of this is that once it's up and running, these systems drive and people to meet standards, but then there's no further drivers to reduce antibiotic use. So compared to the veterinary side of things, there's basically, once you get to a standard, you stop, whereas the moral arguments in the veterinary side of things tend to drive veterinarians to use less and less and more as much as possible. So what can you say about AMR as a super wicked problem on this basis? Well, national policy making around AMR and agriculture filters down into organisational specific norms, rules and compliance mechanisms. So these are all things that have been generated within these organisations of ways of implementing this demand to use less antibiotics. The incongruence of problem definitions between the veterinary side of these transactions within a One Health frame and the agriculture side of these transactions in a One Health frame, and the types of plough employed at lower levels, doesn't necessarily mean that if you have different things going on for different stakeholder groups, doesn't stop it being effective. Actually, having people talking at cross purposes but for the same object still works in terms of driving down antibiotic use. But under this, there's actually a lot of unresolved clash in interests and values. Health authorities and practitioners always want more reductions versus farmers wanting to run predictable and efficient production systems. Health authorities and vets seeing AMR as a moral problem, but these types of arguments and forms of power are alienating for farmers. Farmers see antibiotics as a necessary part of agriculture and AMR as an abstract threat. And so the types of calculated arguments that these farmers put forward are bewildering and outrage-inducing for health authorities and public health practitioners in particular. The key message to that is that actually you're more likely to be successful introducing further reforms into if you're using the same compliance mechanisms that you're used to. So in the terms of agriculture, if you want to change antibiotic use in agriculture, you need to change the way in which the infrastructure is structured. You need to change the way it is positioned within practice, rather than just arguing that they should use less. This also has implications for a lot of the communication and media around AMR and agriculture. So for someone who pays attention to this, there is usually an article every 2 or 3 months in a major newspaper pointing to agriculture as a major driver of AMR. This isn't the case in Australia. Basically, AMR for most industries is not a major thing in terms of the risks that it's posing to human health. So a lot of reporting and a lot of the way that we imagine AMR as being a risk from agriculture is based on how antibiotics are used elsewhere in the world or have been previously. It's also quite unreflective of the greater complexity of AMR issues in human health, in agriculture compared to human health. So it doesn't account, as I noted earlier, for the embeddedness of the infrastructures that antibiotics provide. It ignores the significant impacts of the controls imposed by food safety regimes. So when people talk about One Health and they talk about AMR, they don't talk about this body of regulation, which is actually driving practice of farmers. They talk about the liberal regime, which operates around veterinary prescribers, who are limited in the antibiotics that can actually choose because the farmers don't want them to use antibiotics, which will cause problems for the food safety regime. And it doesn't necessarily acknowledge the greater range of values and tensions between the characteristics of use in agriculture and those in human healthcare, especially the responsibilities of farmers who are actually operating, trying to sustain a global common good of cheap, affordable food versus human healthcare, which are trying to sustain the common good of access to effective antibiotics. So I think a much more careful consideration of these two things is probably necessary going forward. And I'll stop there.